Earlier this year, I read Jane Eyre, and I noticed that oftentimes Jane Eyre is pitched to modern audiences as a romance. I agree that the romance itself was a little bit questionable and weird. That being said, I really appreciated Jane Eyre for all of the windows into the main character's life it offered me. It was so much more than a romance. We follow Jane through multiple stages of her life and get to see her deal with multiple different problems that are not obviously connected at all times. It gave me a lot to think about, and the story didn't seem to come to me already pre-digested. I will be mentioning a couple different classics in this video. I don't really feel like you can spoil classics, but I won't be avoiding spoilers in this video. I expect a lot of modern readers who go into a classic like Jane Eyre expecting a romance like those that we have on the shelves today would likely be very confused. In the beginning of the book, we follow Jane as a child, an orphan being mistreated by her aunt who is in charge of raising her. She gets sent off to a boarding school for a huge chunk of the book, and then she ends up becoming a governess where she meets the man of the house who ends up to being the main love interest. There's a lot of drama that goes on in that section, and she ends up leaving his house and going away and doing something completely different for over 100 pages. There's this huge period of time where she's just randomly having another job and meeting her estranged family, where she is just away from the love interest and we're not really focused on that part of the plot or that part of the story. It definitely does not have tight pacing. It doesn't follow a lot of writing advice that we have right now. And I found that in a way refreshing, but also just something really interesting to think about. This style of storytelling, like what we experience when we read Jane Eyre, is different because not everything in the book serves the main plot. There are a lot of digressions, and there are a lot of side stories and side plots, and things that are added into the book that, strictly speaking, could feel irrelevant to someone who's going through the book with a red pen. It's just not very common anymore to leave the main love interest for over 100 pages and become a random school teacher in another community. Digressive storytelling. Not all, but many classics use digressive storytelling. Now, when we hear that term, it sounds negative. It sounds like an author is digressing, which they are, but it makes it sound like they're getting into something irrelevant, they're getting distracted from the plot, they're going on side tangents, they aren't sticking to a good outline for their story. All of that sounds relatively negative, and a modern editor would probably recommend that an author stick to the main plot of the story that the audience chose to pick up when they bought the book. With books published today, the second we don't understand where the author is going or what they are doing, we assume that the book isn't well written. We assume that the digression they're taking can't really serve a purpose and that they just failed at putting the book together in the way that we have become accustomed to. I guess what I'm trying to say is we have very little patience at the moment for experimental writing that we don't immediately understand. Just to be clear, a digression is when a story takes a break from the main plotline to explore something else. And then eventually it gets back to the main plot line. But there could be a significant amount of time where there's a backstory or a side tangent or something completely irrelevant to the main story, and you are, as the reader, asked to just kind of read through that section. The classics get away with digressive storytelling even among modern audiences. If you know that the book has survived generations in the public memory, you're more likely to slow down and give it a chance, even if you don't understand what choices the author is making and why. Les Miserables by Victor Hugo is an epic novel about redemption and revolution in 19th century France. It's very famous today because of the movie and because of the play. Many people hold the story dear. When you actually pick up the book that inspired the movie and the play, you'll notice that the main character, Jean Valjean, is not mentioned for the first 100 or so pages. At the beginning of that novel, the author talks about a priest. Now, the priest himself is not that important to the storyline. He is, but his role in the actual plot is pretty minimal. Basically, Jean Valjean, the main character, steals some silver and the priest forgives him. So was there any reason for Victor Hugo to get into the life and minutiae of what it means to be this priest for 100 pages before introducing the main character? By modern standards, that would never happen. No one would ever publish that book. I will admit that there are some digressions in Les Miserables, because I did read that book, that I thought were a little unnecessary. And I'm not saying every digression is necessarily a good one. I didn't mind the one at the beginning, where I just got to learn about this priest before the main story started. I actually thought that there were a lot of subtle things to be learned and a lot of ideas to sit with that I would never have had the chance to experience if the plot had to be tight and if the author were never allowed to make any digressions. We can find examples of digressions way further back in time than Les Miserables or Jane Eyre. We see digressive storytelling a lot with Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. I found this from the internet. It's going to talk a little bit about a type of digressive storytelling and connect it to Homer. Okay, imagine you're telling a story. You start telling your story, we'll call it Tale A, and then because you need to provide some background information that will help your listener to understand Tale A, you interrupt yourself and veer off into Tale B. And then, while you're in Tale B, which might itself require some background explanation, you launch into yet another narrative, Tale C, to Tale B, to the point in Tale A, where you first interrupted yourself and then you finish your story. But of course, by this point, you've had all this texture, all this additional information that's been provided by what looks like digressions. Tale B, Tale C, etc. But in the end, turn out to be loaded with information crucial to the audience's understanding of the primary narrative. Ring composition, as we call it in classics, is characteristic of the kind of epic narrative you get in the Iliad and Odyssey, and is associated primarily with Homer. It's a very useful means of conveying enormous amounts of interconnected information in a highly entertaining way. The most famous examples occurs in the Odyssey, actually, itself a text that revels in digressions, wanderings, circularity. In a suspenseful passage in Book 19 where Odysseus, finally returned home after 20 years, is recognized by his old nurse, who sees a telltale scar on his leg, at which point the whole scene grinds to a halt while Homer gives you the story of the scar, which eventually spirals all the way back to Odysseus' infancy. Only then does the narrative return gradually to the moment of the nurse's recognition of the scar. Part of what stood out to me from the analysis of digressions in the Odyssey is that oftentimes when you immediately experience a digression that is basically explaining something that you're seeing in front of you, it starts to feel like it might not be connected, but later on it becomes essential information for you to understand the depth and complexity behind what you are seeing in the present moment. Of course, as I am going through this video, I am mentioning a bunch of digressions in classics that have stood the test of time, and we know that not every piece of literature that was ever written has stood the test of time. It feels natural to be skeptical when a modern author starts to use digressive storytelling. There are legitimately poor authors who will digress without a bigger purpose, and it does just end up being poorly written. I do think that we miss something if we no longer allow for slow, digressive storytelling and we don't give the book that we are currently reading at least the benefit of the doubt for the moment. Not all classics that use digressive storytelling as a legitimate literary device are really old. Here we have an example from The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I found an analysis of this online as well. Novelists and nonfiction narrative writers also use digressions. J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye is replete with these departures from the main plot, mirroring the manic personality of its rebellious teen hero, Holden Caulfield. Digressions seem to stray from the main topic, but their purpose is to heighten the reader's understanding. A famous one is Holden's fixation with a pair of nuns he meets at a restaurant. He helps them with their suitcases, feels badly that they are eating just toast and coffee, and gives them $10. That's what I like about these nuns, he reflects. You could tell, for one thing, that they never went anywhere swanky for lunch. It makes me so damn sad when I thought about it. They're never going anywhere swanky for lunch or anything. I knew it wasn't too important, but it made me sad anyway. The nuns reappear in his consciousness as he worries about their poverty. At the novel's end, he looks for them, wondering if he might run into them collecting donations. Like many digressions, Salinger's focus is on minor characters. In this case, their only purpose is to tell the reader more about Holden and his concern with morality, which is a major theme of the book. I've come to realize that one of the reasons I like classic literature when I have time to sit down and really spend some time with the book is because of digressions. It feels like when a book is willing to take you somewhere unexpected, the story comes to you a little bit less pre-digested. It isn't already organized with all of the ideas neatly lined up. Sometimes when you have to grapple with these digressions, as a reader, you have to do a little bit more work as you find the meaning between all of the different scenes yourself. It does require a little bit more work on the part of the reader, and I think that that's definitely not something that you might always be in the mood for. I am not a pure classics reader, but when you are, it is a really good experience, and it allows you to make connections that might not be easy to make with books that are structured in a different way. For me, it's almost calming and relaxing, although it may be a little bit more demanding. Modern books feel different. At the moment, I feel like a lot of us have little patience with slow storytelling or anything that is slow or anything that takes digressions. Because of that, a lot of the books that are published do follow a similar format in a similar sort of plot progression, and this is the one that is generally taught in schools. You are introduced to a character at the beginning of the book, you get to see their life a little bit, and then shortly they are presented with a problem. This escalates to be whatever the main conflict is in the book, whatever that may be. You have some rising action, you have a climactic event, and then you just bring the character back down to normal and end the story. I want to be clear that there is nothing wrong with the structure. I actually think, especially for an author that is getting started or for anyone who is trying to appeal to a wide audience, that is probably the best structure to choose. And outlining your book and having an idea of where you're going is the right way to go most of the time. All I'm saying is that these modern ideals that come from how we're teaching writing now and how we expect stories to be told to us now are very different from Jane Eyre. I guess you could say Jane Eyre has a lot of little mini stories built into one. You're following this main character, and you're not following one main conflict the entire time, but rather following her throughout her life in different stages. Not everything in Jane Eyre serves the main plot or focus directly, but as the reader, you really get a deeper understanding of who Jane is and what motivates her. Where did this come from? So why do modern books feel so different? Where did this tight, structured format come from, and how did we go from stories that are classics that feel sometimes disorganized with tons of digressions to the same structure for plot over and over and over again in every new release? The biggest influence is actually screenwriting. There is this concept that a good story should have a clear beginning, a clear middle, and a clear end. This goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, especially when you're talking about the plays that were done in ancient Greece. This is not a new concept. This idea of the tightly structured, perfectly paced novel is not new, but it did become the only acceptable way to write in modern days. In the 1970s, a screenwriting teacher named Sid Field wrote a book about how to write the perfect screenplay. He made the beginning, middle, end idea that makes a tight and understandable story, coming all the way back from the Greeks, into a very prescriptive formula. Your first act should be 25%, your middle act should be 50%, and your last act should be 25%. Specific things have to happen at specific moments, and if you deviate from that pacing, you're going to lose your audience to boredom or distraction. And you know what? This makes perfect sense for something like a movie. A movie is only an hour and a half or 2 hours. You need to get right to the point, and you need to tell your story quickly, and you need to wrap it up. It can be really expensive to shoot a movie. You have a completely different format with completely different needs. Every scene genuinely has to move the plot forward because you don't have time for anything else. In the 1980s and the 1990s, this approach to screenwriting became more standard for books. Obviously, movies became the default way that a lot of people experienced stories, but also a lot of books started having the desire to later become a movie. So if you kind of structure it the same way, it's a lot easier to figure out the adaptation later. Quickly, from K-12 education to workshops to YouTube videos to all the places you can learn how to write, started giving this method as the way you should write and the correct way to write. Hook your reader from the first page, make sure everything serves a plot, cut anything that doesn't serve the plot, show don't tell, and keep your pacing tight. Sometimes these are presented as universal rules for good storytelling. If you deviate from them, your story is not going to be as good as if you followed them. But really, I see these as screenwriting rules applied to novels. I'm not alone in this analysis. K.W. Weiland on her website talks about this. She said, "These days, everyone is writing movies, including novelists, not screenplays, mind you, but even if you've never touched a Celtics program and will never see your story on the big screen, you're still writing movies." What we lost. When we make books follow the same format as movies or plays, we lose what can be done exclusively by the novel. Not every book should be easy to adapt into a movie or a TV show because it's a book. It's a different format. You have different strengths. You have different things you can explore. A novel can spend a lot of time in a character's head. A novel doesn't have to be rushed. You don't have the same constraints that you have when you are getting a lot of people together to make a well-polished 2-hour movie. We really don't have to have the next major plot point every 5 pages. There is the ability to sit with something for a minute and cause the reader to think a little bit longer than you would be able to think as the reader if everything comes to you all the time, perfectly structured and perfectly pre-digested. A lot of classic literature does include a lot of digression. If you read most classics, you will see a passage that you could probably mark as a digression. This is one reason I would say to choose reading as a format that is distinct and different than the other types of art that you might consume, like movies or plays, music, all these other things. Books can make you sit with something for a while, and we shouldn't lose that strength. When a book is so tightly plotted and the author is so careful to never have even a moment of filler, the author ends up doing a lot of the interpretive work for you. They're showing you what matters and why, and spoon-feeding you everything that the novel could possibly give to you. The meaning of everything is built so perfectly into the structure to the point that some novels can feel very on the nose. There's no need to sit and reflect on anything for more than 30 seconds if everything has been already done for you. Right now, when everything is bombarding us and there's a lot of information in our faces and a lot of demands for our time, it can be really hard to sit with something that isn't already pre-digested. I will say, if you individually choose to occasionally pick up a book that does include digressive storytelling, I think you will have a richer reading experience. Not all digression is good digression. I know you can probably think of a ton of passages from books that you've read that did include digressions that you maybe hated, and maybe just very much disliked. You can probably name classics, if you are a reader of classics, that include digressions that the book literally didn't need, and you can't think of a single reason for why it's included in this book. That is all very true. I am not necessarily saying that everything should become an 1,000-page novel. I would get tired pretty quickly if everything had to go on multiple digressions that each lasted for over 100 pages. It is definitely worth noting that back when serialized literature was more common, meaning different parts of the book would come out in installments a little bit at a time, some authors were paid for the length of their stories. For example, Charles Dickens, who is a classic Victorian novelist, did oftentimes release his books in sections, and he got paid by the word to a certain extent. So if there are incentives for longer stories, authors will always follow those incentives, just like any other human. If you get paid to write longer stories, you are going to write longer stories. And I can't deny that the way author compensation differs from time period to time period is going to make a difference in how stories are told. Don't think that I'm calling you uncultured if you fail to appreciate a digression that serves literally no purpose. Sometimes digressions just serve literally no purpose. They can though, and I think that we're missing something in literature altogether if we never give an author a chance to digress, especially when the digression that they are choosing to include in a story will later connect and give deeper meaning. I do stand by the title of this video, even though I didn't really mention it. I think a lot of classics that include these long digressions would not be published today, and if they were, they would be so extremely edited as to be almost unrecognizable. We should bring back a certain amount of patience and a certain amount of reflection. Not everything always has to be fast-paced. Not everything always has to be perfectly plotted. If there is something to say and something to learn about the human experience, but it doesn't directly help the rising action of the story, I would like an author to put it in anyway. Not every book has to serve the same purpose, and not every book has to follow an identical structure. I do actually really enjoy a lot of modern fiction, and I actually don't think that the fact that some books are kind of written like screenplays is an issue. It works for a lot of books, and especially with something like a thriller, it keeps me extremely entertained, and I appreciate that so many people are so focused on keeping us entertained and keeping books interesting. All I'm saying is a lot of our beloved classics wouldn't be published today. Sometimes it feels like there's not a lot of room for what seems to be these outdated literary techniques. If a new author tried to implement the style and included a couple digressions, even with a purpose, the book would be quickly DNF'd by the majority of the audience, and we would give it a 2-star review on Goodreads. That change can't be a good thing. Thanks for watching.